It's Mo. It is August 7th, and I've read 3 books in August so far, so I want to start talking about them. So every month I do my wrap-up as a blog-style wrap-up. I read a few books, and then I talk to you about them as close to when I've read them as I possibly can. I tell you a little bit about each book. I tell you if I liked it, what I thought of it, what it's about, if I think you should read it too, maybe some comparisons to other books, and then I string them all together for one big, long, excessively long video. The first book that I finished was Kafka Was the Rage by Anatole Broyard. This is a memoir, but it was published posthumously, so it is incomplete. Kafka Was the Rage, subtitled A Greenwich Village Memoir, is Anatole's story of coming back from World War II, living in the Greenwich Village in 1946 and 47. So it's about his early years in the Greenwich Village, which is a section of Manhattan in New York. It's about how this section of New York is very bohemian, is a cultural epicenter of ideas, literature, art. Anatole was born in New Orleans and lived in Brooklyn before the war, but he definitely really felt that the war changed him, and he wanted to understand the ideas that were going on in the West Village at the time. He wanted to understand what was going on in New York, what was going on with artists, with writers, and he held artists and writers in like a high regard. So this story is all about him meeting different people and how they kind of help him on that journey. Women that he slept with, it's a lot about sex. Teachers that taught him at the new school, it's a lot about academia and intellectualism. Friends that he met, authors that he knew, and I really, really loved it. His writing is so beautiful, but also very relatable. Knowing Greenwich Village, having grown up adjacent to New York and traveling into New York a lot, this book really resonated with me, and I really understood the places he was talking about, the creative vibe, and the different characters. So I love reading books about this subject anyway, but this was definitely a very specific and interesting take, being right after the war. I've read books like Jack Kerouac and other of the Beats, but this was pre-Beats, so it was an interesting gap that I wasn't as familiar with. I really enjoyed reading it. I wish it had been longer. I wish it had been finished. It felt incomplete in a lot of ways, in that some of the stories that he told were not repetitious or were not repeats of the same story, but definitely followed the same themes. So I think that if he had had more time to work on this book and to edit it and to add in other stories, it would have felt more well-rounded. And it definitely does kind of fall off at the end with no real thesis or conclusion or wrap-up of his life or what was going on, obviously, because he died while writing it. He has written other books, and many of them are about similar topics, maybe not quite so autobiographical, so I would definitely love to pick up more of his work. I did tab quite a bit at the bottom, which is where I tab items that I want to revisit or I want to see. I can definitely picture myself reading this one again. It was super short, super fast, super easy to get through. So if you're interested in a slice of life or a time and place of Greenwich Village or of New York around this time period, I would definitely suggest picking it up. The next book that I finished was 19 Claws and a Blackbird by Agustina Bazterrica. This is a collection of short stories, and it was translated from the Spanish by Sarah Moses. So I've never read any Agustina Bazterrica before. She's most known for Tender is the Flesh. I got Tender is the Flesh and this book recently while I was in Ohio, but I decided to start with this one because people don't like this one as much. I also read it for Summerween in July. I did start this book in July, but I didn't finish it till August. This book has 19 stories and a blackbird, 20 stories in it. They're all very, very short. They're all horror or horror adjacent. A lot of them have child abuse, sexual assault in them. None of them were that great. I agree with everyone. A lot of these stories to me felt unfinished. A lot of them felt undercooked, or like they were just something that she jotted down in her notebook, and then when they were like, you need to do another English language collection, you know, she got them out. They didn't feel fully formed a lot of times. They didn't feel that original sometimes. I think especially some of the ones that include like sexual assault and child molestation were a little flat. Like you didn't feel connected very much to the story, and it felt like the child abuse was put in almost as like just a sensational imagery or sensational aspect of the story. So to me that felt like a little cheap, you know, like if there's to be impact from a story like that, and for it not to just feel like a gimmick and a gross and disturbing and, you know, horrible gimmick, then I need a little bit more to the story. Obviously, that could have something to do with the cultural differences between me and the author. It could have something to do with the translation. I'm not sure. But overall, there was only one story in this collection that I really liked. It was the first story, which according to Scott at Gunpowder and Fiction and Plot, this first story really has to be the best one to really grab you. So I do think that that is true. I think the first story in this was the best and the one that grabbed me the most. I'd skip it. The next book that I finished in August was Castle Perilous by DeChancie. This is a Portal novel, and I read it for a Portal book reading vlog, which should be coming out hopefully before this wrap up. But this is a reread for me. The Castle Perilous books that starts with Castle Perilous, and Castle Perilous was written in 1988, were books that I loved as a young person. So as a teenager, early adult, I loved these books. I read quite a few of them. I only really remember this book, and I only remember certain aspects of this book, but I definitely know that I read at least the next 2 or 3, and probably more than that. They all blur together, so I'm not sure how many more. I remember reading Castle Perilous many, many times, and I even have the dog ear of where I left off the last time that I started rereading it, which was probably over 20 years ago. I mean, I always kept it on my shelf. It was always a book that I knew that I loved. I was happy to revisit it. I wanted to revisit it, and I don't think it disappointed. I actually really, really enjoyed my reread of Castle Perilous. Castle Perilous is really about Castle Perilous, which is a castle kind of out of time that people come to through portals from different worlds, and it is a magical nexus, a place of transition where people can go. Castle Perilous does exist in its own time and its own place, and there is a owner, guardian, king-ish type person of Castle Perilous who is fighting a battle with people who want to destroy Castle Perilous in the time and place where it exists. But within Castle Perilous, you could come from anywhere, anytime, any place, any planet, through a portal from your own world, and once you enter Castle Perilous, it gives you everything you need. It provides you with food that you need. It provides you with clothing. It provides you with translation, so everyone in Castle Perilous can understand each other while they're in the castle. And we follow quite a large cast of characters to start, but our 3 main characters are Jean, Linda, and Snowclaw, and they are 3 people who came from different portals, from different times, from different places into Castle Perilous, but became fast friends once they find each other within the castle. So they go on, at first, kind of an adventure to figure out how to get out of Castle Perilous, figure out what Castle Perilous is all about, and also get to know each other, get to know other people in the story. And then the other books, I believe there still are 3 main characters, and we go on from there. This is just a super fun, silly adventure story. It definitely does jump around a little bit, and it definitely does have some things that you have to get used to. It reminded me a lot, actually, of Piranesi upon this reread, because Castle Perilous is an infinite space with many rooms. It has floods, it has trees, it has vine monsters, it has dining halls, and you never know who you're going to find or what you're going to find or who's been there before or what time period you're in while you're in Castle Perilous. So it reminded me a lot of Piranesi's house, which is also the world. Castle Perilous is a world unto itself in a lot of respects, and it is definitely a character in this book. Really enjoyed my reread of this. Definitely plan to continue on with the series. I think they all came out on audio in 2023, or at least a large portion of this series. I do want to read more. I like reading this one on audio, but I think because there were so many characters, and because in this first book you're really trying to understand who all the characters are, how they're connected, what Castle Perilous is, how it's connected to everything else, it was a little bit hard to follow and I needed to kind of pay attention. But I think in further books, once you've got the hang of it, they'll be easier to read. Definitely love this one. If you're looking for a Portal World book, I would suggest it. But know that it is quite dated. There's definitely some language and some different things talked about that make it clear that it was written in the 80s. So those are the first 3 books that I've read in August so far, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. Hi, it is August 9th, and yesterday I finished one more book in August. I finished Armistead Maupin's Significant Others. This is the 5th book in the Tales of the City story by Armistead Maupin. I have read books 1, 2, 3, and 4 since joining BookTube. Books 1, 2, and 3 I had read previously. 1 I've read a lot of times. 2 I've read a few times. 3 I read twice. 4 I read just a few months ago, so I will leave the wrap-up where I talk about that book in the description down below, and now I have finished Significant Others. So this one takes place in the 80s. Something that's really fun about this series is that it was written originally in the 70s as a serial in the San Francisco Chronicle, the newspaper, and then it was collected into a book. Subsequently, more books were written, and the books move with the characters and move with the author in actual time. So the first book was written in 1978, I think. The next book was written in 1979. The third book is hedging towards the 80s. The fourth book is in the 80s, and the fifth book takes place, I think, in 1985. I think it was written in 1987, but is a couple years behind the actual author. Yes, correct. So as the characters are growing and changing, so is the landscape of the United States and other places where the characters are and where the books are taking place. Tales of the City is a gay classic, and I would highly recommend picking it up. In the first book, we're really following Marianne Singleton, who is from the Midwest. She comes to San Francisco to visit her friend, and while she's there, her eyes are kind of opened to like a whole new lifestyle, a whole new way of being, to sex, to drugs, to queerness, to adventure, to living on her own, and she decides to stay there. So in the first book, Tales of the City, we're really following her, and she's our gateway into meeting the city, meeting San Francisco, and the city does play a big role in these books, and also to meeting all the people at 28 Barbary Lane, which is where she ends up finding an apartment. So 28 Barbary Lane is the heart of the book, and it's where all the characters meet. Various characters like Brian and Mouse and Mrs. Madrigal and Mona. And we meet all these characters at Barbary Lane, but as the books progress, we see them going different places, we see them having different adventures, we see them living their lives. One thing that I really love about these books, which I don't usually love about books, is that each chapter is a different perspective. It's about a different person. So one chapter will be about Marianne, one chapter will be about Michael Mouse, one chapter will be about Brian, and the characters come and go throughout each other's chapters. But because it was serialized, all the chapters are super, super short. There may be a page, 2 pages, 3 pages, sometimes as much as like 6 or 7 pages, but never more than that. So even if you don't particularly like following a character in a specific book, you never have long to wait until you move on to the next character, until something else happens. And I love that he continued to do that through most of the books. Now I know some of the books are not like that, but I think most of the books are like that. This is mainly a book about Michael Mouse and Brian. It has a lot to do with their relationship as best friends. It has a lot to do with the different things that they are dealing with at the time. Mona's not in this book barely at all. I think she writes a letter in this book and that's it. So like we see other people, but those are the two characters that we're following the most. And the last book was mostly about Mona and Michael Mouse. So like it changes and it flows, and that again makes it super interesting and makes you want to keep reading, super compelling. This book definitely deals with, and all of the Tales of the City book definitely deal with heavy topics, deals with gay bashing and prejudices, it deals with the AIDS crisis, it deals with death and death of family members, it deals with complex family relationships, it deals with trans issues, it deals with queer issues, it deals with being straight and being advocate for the queer community and the trouble that that can cause to show up in your life, you know, even though you're doing what's right. But I think at the heart of these books, it really is about the family, the found family, and the connections that they've made. These books are mostly hopeful, even though hard things happen and even though people die and we're dealing with heavy real life topics, there is hope in these books almost always. And there's also a lot of campiness, a lot of soapiness. These books are very fun and silly and funny and dialogue heavy, which again makes them super easy to like fly through. The banter is great, the relationships are great, the soapiness, the campiness is great, and I can't wait to read more. I think I am going to pause. I feel like 2 a year is kind of my limit on these. Also because although the last book recently came out in 2024, there's a limited amount of books left for me to read. So I don't want to devour them too quickly, even though these are books that I will always, always, always come back to and reread at some point. Like I said, the last book came out in 2024 and Armistead Maupin has said that that's going to be the last book, but fingers crossed, hopefully it is not the last book and he continues to write more in this series like forever until he can't write anymore and, you know, until we can't read anymore. That would be ideal. That's one more book that I read in August, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is August 16th and I have read 4 more books in August. The next book that I read was Trouble in Queenstown by Delia Pitts. This is the second Delia Pitts that I have read, but this is her first, I believe, traditionally published novel, and this follows Vandy, short for Evanderfield, who is a private detective in New Jersey. So all of Delia Pitts' books, as far as I can tell, take place in New York or New Jersey and have some kind of New Jersey tie because Delia Pitts is a New Jersey author, which is awesome. I found the first book of hers that I read, which was something to do with Harlem, I can't remember the name, at a used book sale, and it was a really awesome self-published noir book that I really, really enjoyed. So when I saw that she had a traditional published novel that appears to be the first in a series, I definitely wanted to pick it up. I took this book out from my library on audio, and it is similar to her first book, Lost and Found in Harlem. That's what the first book that I read of hers was. It wasn't her first book, but it was my first book of hers. So it was similar to Lost and Found in Harlem in that we are following someone who's a little bit down on their luck. Our main character, Mandy, was a cop. Her father was the police chief in Queenstown, which is a town city in the northern part of New Jersey. She was a cop for a while in NYPD, and she kind of fell down on her luck. Her father is now in a elderly care facility, and she has returned to her hometown on the behest kind of her best friend to become a private eye. But she's like struggling with her own demons. She's struggling with the ailing health and failing memory of her father, and she's getting little cases here and there, but they're mostly like spouses spying on each other, or like, you know, not glamorous jobs, not saving the world jobs in her private eye investigations. So when Vandy takes a case of a high-profile white man in the area, a rich white man in the area, she is not surprised that he thinks his wife is cheating on him and has hiring her to follow her around and figure out who she's cheating with. Vandy takes the job, but the job quickly changes when the wife of this man is found murdered and the man calls Vandy to the scene of the crime. So that's the basic premise of this book. We definitely learn more about Vandy's life. We learn about why she's not with the NYPD anymore. We learn about her relationship with her father. We learn a relationship with her other family members and her best friend, who is a lawyer, who is the person who convinced her to come back to town and start this PI investigation, and who often uses her in different cases. We learn about the town and the inner workings of this town, the corruption. We learn about the mayor and different people involved in the town, the new police chief, who is one of Vandy's ex-boyfriends. So it's really fun. It's a big cast of characters that you could see coming in and out of different books. Like I said, it felt like the beginning of the series. I don't know if it's technically called the beginning of the series yet, but I would love to read more of Vandy. Delia Pitts seems to write very strong main characters that have interesting pasts. So you're kind of doled out information about their past as the book goes along, but not in like a teasing way where you're like dying to find out and they're not giving you the information, which I find often happens in mystery books. This is much more measured, even way to find out about their past, and it's like exciting because you know more information is coming, so you kind of just go along for the ride. I do think that the ending of Trouble in Queenstown is a little bit predictable, and it wasn't very twisty, and it wasn't very exciting. The big bad just kind of was a big bad, and there wasn't much nuance, I guess, to it. Like, okay, maybe if you've never read this story before, you would be surprised at some of the turns that this story took, but because it was a pretty well told story, it wasn't really surprising to me. I still liked where it went, and it still made for an interesting story, and it made for an interesting book, but it was definitely more about the characters and Vandy herself, her connections with other people, how those people might come back in and out of her life throughout other books in this series. Definitely worth a try. Much less noir than Lost and Found in Harlem, so I definitely still want to continue that series because I thought that first book was great. I liked Lost and Found in Harlem a little bit more than I liked Trouble in Queenstown. Overall, I would definitely read more from Delia Pitts in whatever series I happen to pick up. The next book that I finished in August was The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. So I've actually been reading this as a reread since 2022. My husband and I read The Hobbit on audio in 2021, and then almost immediately after we picked up and started reading The Fellowship of the Rings on audio as well. We got 75% of the way through and then we stopped. Because my husband and I were reading it together, we only read it at certain times, and we read it from about February of 2022 to October of 2022, and then stopped reading it. And I've decided that I wanted to pick it up. Part of the reason for this decision was that I hated seeing it on my currently reading list on Goodreads and Storygraph, and I just wanted to get it finished. Part of the reason was because I could get the audio off of Libby or Hoopla and listen to it that way. So we had previously been listening to it from a free audio site because we didn't have Libby or Hoopla at that time, but now I was able to get it from my library. And part of the other reason is because I don't like the Andy Serkis versions. I like Andy Serkis just fine, but I don't want to hear him reading Lord of the Rings or anything else for that matter. He's too much of the characters that he plays. He's too much Gollum, even in his other voices for the other characters in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So I didn't want to listen to Andy Serkis. Libby has, and Hoopla have Rob Inglis doing the narration, so I decided to pick it up. I had to wait on hold for quite a while. When it finally came in, I read the last quarter of the Fellowship of the Rings. I'm sure everybody knows what The Lord of the Rings is about. The Hobbit, which is a prequel to The Lord of the Rings, or the first in the series, depending on how you look at it, is about Bilbo Baggins and his adventure with Gandalf the Wizard. Bilbo is a hobbit, and their race is traditionally people who like to stay home, who don't like to wander the country, who like to stay in the Shire. Bilbo is a hobbit who longs for adventure, and so when Gandalf proposes this adventure to him, he is ready to go off, leave the Shire, and go on an adventure. So that's the first book, The Hobbit. During The Hobbit, Bilbo finds a ring, and in Lord of the Rings, we're taking that ring to a special place to destroy it. This ring is too powerful. It's the one ring to rule them all. And we see Bilbo's young cousin, I think, and maybe he's a nephew, maybe he's a cousin, I don't know. We see Frodo taking on the task to go with Gandalf and destroy the One Ring. So the first book reintroduces us to Bilbo, introduces us to Frodo, reintroduces us to Gandalf, as well as the Fellowship of the Ring, which are a group of different people from different species and different walks of life who are going to help Frodo take the ring and destroy it. That's the basic premise of Lord of the Rings. The first book follows that group. We meet them and we start this long trek and adventure to destroy the One Ring. Whereas The Hobbit is very whimsical and fun and adventure story and silly, with lots of songs and singing and silly tales and little side quests that they go off on, Fellowship of the Ring is much more focused, much more centered, and much more serious. Tolkien made like an extensive surrounding mythology, world building. So world building is a huge part of the Fellowship of the Rings and the Lord of the Rings trilogy in general. Character development is a huge part of this story, and it was nice to reread this one. I've read Fellowship of the Rings a couple of times. I've read The Two Towers, which is the next book, once, and then I didn't get all the way through The Return of the King. So I do plan on rereading The Two Towers next on audio and moving on to The Return of the King at some point. I would love to have this trilogy finished by the end of the year. I find these books very comforting. I find them very exciting. There's a lot of thrilling moments. There's a lot of exciting moments. There's moments where people you love perish. There's moments where people or characters that you're attached to turn against people. There's intrigue. There's politics. There's action. There's chase scenes, there's injury, so many different things. There's love stories. I just think these are really great classic high fantasy novels, but they're, to me, very accessible. As you probably know from watching this channel, I'm not a big high fantasy person, but I just find The Lord of the Rings to be very accessible, even though there's new words, even though there's tricky language, even though there's singing, which is not my favorite. I find these books to be really fun and engaging and thrilling, and so I definitely plan on continuing the series. The next book that I read in August is In the Palm of Darkness by Montero. This is translated from the Spanish by Edith Grossman. This is a book that I found at a used book sale, and just because it was translated, I picked it up, and also because the premise is a quest for an elusive amphibian, and I love frogs and toads. This book takes place from two perspectives, which isn't usually my favorite, but I really enjoyed this one. One perspective is our main character, Victor, who is Australian, I think, and he is traveling to Haiti to find this aforementioned elusive amphibian. He gets connected up with a guide, Thierry, who is a Haitian man who has lived in the mountains where this frog is found for his whole life. Victor is commissioned by a frog hunter who is now too old and frail to go into the field, and Thierry has history with frog hunters in his past. So we meet Victor and find out about his circumstances, his wife that he left behind, and what led him to go on this frog hunt in the Haitian mountains. And then we also learn about how he was connected up with Thierry, and we learn about Thierry's story as well. Kind of the framing narrative for this is that Victor is telling us a story, and he's telling us that Thierry is telling him stories about Thierry's life. So Thierry's chapters are what Victor has just told us that Thierry told him, basically, which is kind of fun, and I think that's why it works in the dual perspective. And then there are these little vignette parts in between which have facts, like I don't know if they're actually facts, but in the book they're considered facts of frogs around the world and how frogs are disappearing and how it's harder to find the endangered species of frogs that used to be more prominent in various countries in the world. And of course this is set in Haiti, so we're dealing with the politics of Haiti and the pollution of Haiti and the class disparity of Haiti, and all of that is a backdrop for Victor and Thierry's stories, both in the current day with when we're reading and also their pasts and how their pasts are connected to Haiti as a country. So I really loved this one. I thought this was a great book. I would have thought that this book was written by a man. I read this book for Women in Translation Month, but I would have thought that it was a male author, partly because of the style and the cadence, partly because there's two male main characters, and partly because the way women are talked about in this book sounds like it's from a male perspective. Like there's a lot of misogyny in the description of women, and I'm assuming that that is because of the character's history and the character's narrative and the character's perspective. I mean, I'm glad to have read this. I'm glad that it was written by women and it qualified for Women in Translation Month, but I was a little bit surprised that it had such a male authorial voice. To me, you know, like what even does that mean? I don't know. But to me, it did. I really liked the frog facts. I really liked the themes of displacement and disappearance of amphibians, of men of the past, of these particular men as individuals, but as this breed of man, these two different breeds of men. I thought it was really interesting. It was really scary. There was some gross parts. There's definitely some animal violence. Not like super depicted on the page, but depicted. There's sexual assault, there's rape, there's death, there's murder, like lots of trigger warnings. But overall, I really, really love this one. I would love to read more by Mayra Montero, and I was so happy to get to this one. Highly recommend. If you're interested in any of these subjects, if you're interested in complex relationships, if you're interested in male bonding, if you're interested in frogs and toads, I would definitely suggest this one. The last book that I've read so far in August was Portrait of an Unknown Lady by Maria Gainza, translated by Thomas Bunstead. This is a short novella by Gainza, who is a Argentinian author. This was translated from the Spanish. I read this for Women in Translation Month. I actually don't know if our narrator is named or not. I think she's unnamed. So this follows a unnamed narrator who was kind of an aimless young woman, but she decides to become the assistant to a art dealer on kind of a dare by her family members to actually get a job. So our main character gets a job with this art dealer, and we kind of quickly learn that this art dealer is not just an art dealer, but she is a forger, and she specializes in forging from one particular artist. This artist, when our main character first meets the forger, is in vogue, but she kind of falls out of vogue. The story follows our main character's relationship with the art forger, and then later our main character's obsession with this artist that the forger is known for. We meet our main character as she's checking into a hotel and as she's writing down her crimes, and that is the structure for the book, for the novella, is listening to her story as she's writing it down, as she's, we don't know, being hunted, being arrested, escaping, like we're not sure. I really enjoyed this one. I listened to it all on audio, all in one day. It's a very short audio book, and I just got it out of the library. I'd never heard of it before. So I've been going on like Instagram and different places to try and find different works in translation by women for Women in Translation Month, and this is just one that came across my path that sounded really interesting and I wanted to give a try. I do think that it suffered a little from reading it while I was doing other things, because I think that there's a lot of characters in this book, a lot of observations that our main character makes about various people in the art scene who are collectors, who are other art dealers, who are just kind of hangers-on of the art dealer that she knows. There's a lot of observations about the artist and her life and the characters in the artist's life. So like there's a lot of people, a lot of names mentioned, a lot of observations made, some of them important, some of them not important. And we kind of get the characterization of our main character from this because she starts out as this pampered, spoiled, non-working woman and turns into a woman of great observation, of obsession, of hard work. I understand the idea of the novel, but sometimes reading it while I was doing other things, I was a little bit confused as to who was who and what was going on and who was important and who wasn't. But by the end of the novel, my hesitations kind of fell away. I don't think that it was super memorable, or it will be super memorable in the future. I don't think this is one that I'm going to think of often or refer to often, but I really did enjoy reading it, and I would definitely read more by this author. And when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is August 26th, and I finished a few more books in August. I finished The 10,000 Doors of January, which I was reading for a Portal fantasy vlog, the second of the Portal book vlogs that I'm doing. The 10,000 Doors of January is by Alex E. Harrow. I've never read any Alex E. Harrow. I think they predominantly do like young adult stuff, but also like light fantasy, and some people really like them, some people don't like them as much. I got this copy of The 10,000 Doors of January at a little free library. It is a ARC copy. I really like the cover of this book though. I think it's really pretty. This is a Portal fantasy about our main character, January, who lives in Vermont, mostly with her patron, who is an older rich man with this castle-like mansion in Vermont. Her father does live there part-time, but her father works for her patron, and she is the ward of this patron when her father is away. So he has taken over like her schooling and her upbringing for the most part, because her father is off finding archaeological digs and archaeological artifacts and other artifacts for the patron. January has a wandering spirit, definitely. She is in search of an adventure sometimes, but she's always torn between being the proper young lady that her patron wants her to be and finding her way in the world. Now she's a teenager and she is discovering things about the world and about her patron and about her father, who she longs for more than anything and longs to accompany on his journeys more than anything throughout this book. So when January was a child, she found a door that led to another world, and she has never quite been able to get that out of her head. And when she finds a book in a mysterious trunk in the mansion in Vermont, she ends up reading a book within a book, a story within this story of 10,000 more doors that she might be able to find. So that's the basic premise. It follows like a pretty standard young adult trajectory of her finding out about these doors and reading this book and the adventures that she goes on and reading about the adventures in the book within a book. I didn't know that this was in a book within a book. I really liked that aspect of it. I liked that the Portal fantasy part of this was multiple doors, multiple places, multiple worlds that you could go to. I thought it was fun that January was like not like other girls, that she might have some abilities and some proclivities towards finding these doors. And as we read the book within the book and as we read this book, we find out more about that. I thought this was like totally fine. It didn't have too much angst. It didn't have too much like romance. It didn't have too much pining for her father and her lost parents. It did have a lot of those tropes. Like it did have, you know, not your typical girl kind of trope. It had the absent parents / dead parents trope. It had the mysterious patron, is he good or is he bad kind of trope. But I enjoyed it. It was all those tropes. It was all those things that you see often, but I thought it was done in a fun and interesting way. And like I said, I really liked the portal fantasy of it. So specifically reading this for a portal fantasy vlog, I think it works really well. And it meshes well with the other portal fantasies that I've read, like Castle Perilous and the Wayward Children series. If you're interested in YA, if you're interested in portal fantasy, I would definitely pick this up. It was not super memorable. There wasn't anything super new or innovative going on in it, but it was perfectly fine and fun and a perfectly good time. Worth the few hours that I read reading it on audio for sure. The next book that I read in August was I Called Him Necktie by Milena Michiko Flossier. The author is a German-Japanese writer who lives in Germany. This was translated by Sheila Dickey. I read this for Women in Translation Month. This is translated from German, but she is part Japanese and traveled to Japan. This story is about a young man who is, let me see, if I can get this word right. There's a little glossary in the back, which is nice. And our young main character, his name is Hiro, a hikikomori, which is a reclusive young man. So this is a trend in Japan where young people end up not kind of entering society once they get out of school, not going to college, not finding a job or a trade, and living in their parents' house as like a recluse or like almost an anchor, like someone who never leaves the house, someone who plays video games or does other activities that they never have to leave the house, and they live off of their parents. And this is often a sad thing for their parents because obviously they want their kids to be fulfilled and to live a good life and to be productive in life and to go off and have their own families and jobs and careers and all that stuff. But it's also looked down upon in society that the parents let them do this. So our young man Hiro is a little bit different than the majority of these recluses in that he is reclusive from traumatic events and he doesn't do the kind of things like waste his life playing video games. He is mostly contemplative when he's on his own, but he's also not like the rest of these recluses because he does start venturing out when his parents aren't around, and he ends up going to a park every day that he remembers fondly from childhood and sitting on a bench. Once he's done this for several weeks, several months, he sees a man who wears a necktie who's like a Japanese businessman come to the park every day and sit on the bench opposite him every day for long periods of time, like our protagonist Hiro does. Hiro tries to shun any contact with anyone, any contact with the outer world. Hiro's extremely nervous and repelled by the idea of any kind of responsibility, even if it's just social responsibility. It is quite a bit later, and I never got to finish talking about I Called Him Necktie, so I don't know where I left off. My camera died and I had to charge the battery, and then it was, you know, however many days later, as it has been. I enjoyed this book. This book is more of a character study of these two men and the relationship between them and the expectations that are put on people who live in Japan, specifically young men, specifically hikikomori, whether those be young men or women, and specifically like businessmen. And that pressure and expectation that's put on businessmen is talked about in a lot of other Japanese literature that I've seen or that I've read. I think the one book from Murakami that I've read talked about that, and so it's interesting to see it brought up here. But like I said, I think this book is really about the relationship of these two men and how that relationship changes their ideas of life and how to live. So it is a little bit heartwarming in that respect, but there is a lot of tragedy and a lot of pressure for these two men, and the circumstances that have led them to where they are today is very depressing, is very dark. Especially the young main character's history is pretty difficult to read at times, and he's suffered through a lot of tragedy that he's seen in other people, if it hasn't been like specifically his own tragedy. But I really enjoyed this one. I liked that it was told in this really short short vignette style. And it was interesting that like it was broken into chapters instead of just vignettes. So there are a bunch of chapters, over 110 chapters in this book. And so it was kind of an interesting way to read it. It definitely made the reading experience fly by, but it also made it easy to stop when you were in the middle of like a heavy moment or when you were in a place where you wanted to get away for a minute. I didn't see the outcome necessarily of this book being what it was. Love this press too. I did a little more research after reading this one. This is New Vessel Press, and they seem to put out all translated work, and I really liked the little softcover version that I got, and I just really liked that they put out something that I've never heard of. I've never heard of anyone talk about on BookTube. I've never seen anyone else read, so I'm definitely planning on sourcing some more of these books, trying to find them used, trying to get some of the books that were interesting. It's very old style to me, but I like when presses do like other books that they have in the back. NYRB does that as well, and sometimes I just really love to like read the back and read all the other books that are in there and think about the other books that I would want to get from those presses. If you've ever read this book, definitely let me know, because I've never heard of anyone else reading it. The next book that I read in August is Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. This is a collection of short stories, and I read this for the TBR Spin. This was actually my June book, and yes, I'm reading it in August, so I am super far behind. But luckily, I vlog all my TBR Spin books, so you can see a full vlog of this. Her Body and Other Parties is a collection of speculative stories that all have to do with women's bodies in some way or another. They're mostly horror, definitely speculative, some sci-fi, some kind of fantasy-esque. The first one is a retelling of a classic horror story and ties in other classic horror stories or other classic urban legends. There's stories about women being assaulted. There's stories about women's deaths. There's stories about justice for women in here. I think a big theme of these stories is like the individual woman and her connection to her own body a lot of times. I really loved some of these short stories. The first 4 I thought were stronger than the final 4. There is a crazy story in here where it's all vignettes. It's like 50 or 60 pages of vignettes of episodes of Law and Order SVU, which is, I think, a really interesting and silly way to write a short story. But I love that about Carmen Maria Machado's writing. Like, it seems like she's really doing experimental things and interesting things, but I think she pulls them off. A lot of time when I read experimental stories like that, I think that they're just like a writing exercise, and so they stuck it in a book that they wrote eventually, or they stuck in a collection of short stories. But these all feel like purposeful experimentation in her own writing and her own ideas of how she could tell stories. So in that way, they felt very cohesive, even though each one was told in a pretty different way. My favorite story out of all these was called Inventory, and that's another vignette story that has an overarching plot line that kind of sneaks into the way the story is written, which I really, really enjoyed. So this one was dark, definitely scary, not like frightening scary, like you don't want to read it alone at night, but like more psychologically scary. But if you're interested in short stories, I would definitely check it out. The next book that I read in August was Blue Bear Woman by Virginia Pesemappio Bordelot, something like that, who is a Cree author from Canada. And this is a book that was written in Cree originally and translated by Susan Oreo and Christelle Morelli. So this is a very short translated work that I picked up for Women in Translation Month. I read this from Hoopla, and I saw this one. It sounded really interesting. I've never read a book that was translated into English from any sort of Indigenous language, I don't think, but definitely not any American or Canadian Indigenous language. So I thought this was super interesting, and I feel like these books are probably pretty rare to find. Blue Bear Woman follows our main character, whose name is similar to Virginia. I think it's Veronica or something like that. So you already get the feeling as soon as you start the book that this is going to be pretty much an auto-fiction version of Virginia's life or events that have happened to Virginia. So our main character is an older woman, and she has remarried, and she and her husband are traveling around Canada, seeing her family and learning about her ancestral history and learning about her culture and how she may possibly want to be a shaman or a medicine woman. So she's traveling around Canada with her white American husband or white Canadian husband and meeting people who she's distantly related to, who she's closely related to. She's visiting family, and as she does, she is also learning and telling us the story of her ancestors, and specifically a great uncle of hers whose body was never recovered after they went out on a hunt. So she's learning about that story as we are, and she feels a deep connection. And one of the things that we quickly find out about our main character is that she has dreams that are probably visions. And we also learn that a lot of medicine people that she's talking to say that she probably is a gifted medicine woman. She's older though, and she has never been told that in her life, and she's never pursued that, especially because her mother was not supportive of her gifts and was even frightened of her gifts. And even as we see our main character traveling around with her husband, we see that he's not necessarily supportive of those gifts either. Because of some of the events in this book, it reminded me a little bit of Hereafter, which is a nonfiction that I read. I think also because those were both set in Canada. Also the idea of displacement of your culture, that you might not know about your culture even though you're living right in among it, that you might not know about your own potential even though you're living right in it. Like I said, Blue Bear Woman, very, very short, super easy to read. As far as the way that it is written, it's told in a very matter-of-fact way. It's not necessarily super easy to read because of subject matter, because it is pretty heavy and it's not necessarily a happy book, but there's a little bit of mystery to it. So I would definitely highly recommend it. I would love to get a physical copy of this one. I would love to reread this one. And of course it has those elements of Native American or Native Canadian Indigenous to the Americas people's spirituality, which I just really, really love reading about in books. This is one, like I said, that before August I had never heard of, so I would love to shout this one out and I would love to get more people to read it. So if you've read this one, definitely let me know. The last book that I've read so far in August is Survive the Night by Riley Sager. This was on my summer TBR. I picked this one up, I think, at a Goodwill. I've read two other Riley Sagers before, and I wasn't sure about this one because this is the one that everybody says is really, really bad. This is the one that everybody says is their worst book. So Riley Sager is actually a pseudonym for a New Jersey writer, and I really love that there's a lot of New Jersey in this book. I wasn't sure I was gonna fully read this one. I started reading it physically and I got about 20 pages, 30 pages in and was like, I don't know if this is for me. But the hold that I had on the audiobook came through, so I was like, okay, well, I'll listen to what I've already read. I listened to that part and I was like, if I want to keep going, I'll keep going. So Survive the Night is about a young woman named Charlie, and she is leaving her college in New Jersey and she needs to get a ride. It is 1991 and she doesn't have a car and she's trying to get back to Ohio. It is not the holidays, it is not Thanksgiving, it is not the end of term. She's leaving in the middle of school time, and we learn that she's decided to leave the school and leave her boyfriend and flee back to Ohio because her best friend at the school was murdered. So we meet Charlie and we kind of learn a little bit about her relationships with her boyfriend and with her best friend, and we learn the circumstances of her best friend's death as Charlie is getting ready to get in a ride share with a man that she's never met. Being 1991, there are no cell phones. There is a murderer loose on the campus who has murdered other girls besides Charlie's best friend, and she promises her boyfriend that if anything weird happens, she'll get out of the car. But she meets a man at the rideshare board and quickly decides to take a ride with him, even though there are a bunch of red flags. Charlie has trouble seeing red flags because Charlie plays movies in her head. She had traumatic experience in her childhood, and ever since then, sometimes she can't distinguish reality from these movies that play in her mind. So a lot of this book we're seeing Charlie go through an experience only to find out that it is actually all in her head, which of course makes her a very unreliable narrator because she's not entirely sure when she's dreaming up these movies and we're not entirely sure when she's dreaming up these movies. And that's the biggest problem I've seen with this book, that people really hate that aspect of it. But honestly, there wasn't like too much of that. I think a more worthy reason to not like Charlie as a main character is that she's dumb, and that she does dumb things. But at about halfway point, it kind of turns around and Charlie comes into her own a little bit. So Charlie goes on this rideshare with this stranger, and of course, bad things happen. Of course, she's ignored those red flags. Of course, she gets into serious trouble. I think the actual worst thing about this book is that it is incredibly obvious. If you have read one Riley Sager book, then you know who the killer is immediately, and I called it from the first time I heard about this person on the page. You also know like a lot of the plot points that are going to happen. So I think the worst part of this book is it's just incredibly predictable and incredibly obvious, especially, I think it probably is no matter what, but especially if you've read any Riley Sager. Like I said, I've only read 2 other Riley Sagers, and I called it from the minute the person was mentioned. Other than that, I don't think it was that horrible. It was fine. It was easy to read. This wasn't an overly gory Riley Sager book. Like sometimes they're a little bit more like gory and gross. Sometimes they're a little bit more like frightening. This one wasn't one of those, so it was easy to get through the violence in this, and it was easy to be interested in Charlie as a character. Maybe you didn't like her, maybe you didn't root for her, but it was fine to, you know, want to know what happened to her, even though it was also pretty obvious like what was going to happen to her. I usually read audiobooks at somewhere between 1.5 and 1.75 speed, and I was easily able to read this at 2 speed, so I got through this one really quickly. I'm happy to have knocked another Riley Sager off my list, but they're not books that I like love, and they're not books that I keep on my shelves. They're fun, summer, fluffy reads that I pass on to friends or put back in the little free library. And when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is August 30th, and I've read one more book in August. I am in the middle of a couple of other books, so I might finish another book, but I wanted to talk to you about Ice Planet Barbarians, which is the first book in the Ice Planet Barbarians series. I read this book partly to see what all the hype was about, but partly for Garb August, which is a readathon put on by Ollie at Criminali, all about reading trashy books. I don't know if Ice Planet Barbarians was a good trashy book or a bad trashy book, but it did fulfill some of the prompts on the Garb August bingo board, and I was wanting to read it at some point. It's only about a 5-hour audiobook, so I read this one on audio, and it follows our main character, Georgie, who is abducted by aliens in the very beginning of this book, and she's put on this alien ship with a bunch of other girls, and it's very unpleasant. It's not cool. There's a lot of sexual assault and abuse of women in the first, like, I don't know, 20 minutes of this book. So at that 20-minute point where there was a really horrible sexual assault rape scene, I was like, I don't know if I want to keep reading this. Not my kind of book, and not my kind of sexy book, as this is supposed to be a like smutty, sexy romance. But I did make it past that point, and then at about the hour mark, I was like, I don't know if I want to read this either. I might DNF it, but I decided to just push through and finish this very short audiobook. So after Georgie is witness to this horrible event, she starts to come up with plan to escape from her alien captors with the other girls that she's trapped with. But before they can escape, the ship that they're on actually crashes, and when they land on an ice planet world, they're not sure if they're in a better position or a worse position than they were on the alien ship. So that's the very basic premise of this book. But Georgie does meet people, and there is a romance element to this book, and the romance part of the book was very sweet and nice, and I did end up enjoying that aspect of it. I don't think I really enjoyed the smutty aspect of it that much. I didn't think it was like that exciting or that hot, and because this book is so short, I thought that it was very quick from meeting to romance, which is explained in a very good way in this story, but it still just wasn't my cup of tea. I don't think I'll be continuing on with this series. It wasn't that interesting to me, it wasn't that exciting to me, it wasn't that innovative to me, and maybe monster romance just isn't my thing. I would say try it for sure. If you like smutty romance, if you like alien romance, if you like monster romance, give it a shot. I thought the characters were interesting. I thought the dialogue was good. I liked the writing style fine. You know, how much could you like a writing style that you finish in a couple of hours? But it was fine. It just wasn't for me. It is September, and that means it's time to do my wrap-up of the wrap-up. So the last book I talked about was Ice Planet Barbarians, which was the last book that I finished in August. I read so many good things. I continued on in a series, actually several series that I have been reading for a while. I read a bunch of queer books, and I read a lot of books that had like one queer character in it. June is not the only time we should be reading queer books. I read some short stories. I had some rereads. I read so many great books in translation by women authors, and a lot of them with women translators as well, which is great. I love to read for Women in Translation Month, but remember, it's not just for August. You should be reading women in translation all the time. I read a book off my summer TBR. I read a book off of my 24 and 24 TBR. I worked on another Portal vlog. I read some books that I didn't love. I read some books that I did love. I read great short stories. I read mid-short stories. But overall, I had a great reading month, and I didn't push myself too hard. You know, I was reading Ice Planet Barbarians, and I was thinking like, oh, I could finish the books in 2 days that I'm currently reading, or I could read a short story to bump up my reading for the month, or I could this, or I could that. And I just didn't do it, you know? I'm enjoying reading where I'm at right now, and I'm trying not to push myself too hard for no reason. You know what I mean? Like, I just went ahead and read what I wanted to read and stopped when I wanted to stop, and I didn't force it, which was great. But I'm super happy with my reading month in August. Let me know what books you read in August. Let me know if you read any of the books that I read here. Let me know one book in translation that you read in August, because I need more recommendations. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!